Hello and welcome to another exciting lecture for developmental psychology. In this lecture, we'll be talking about relationships in young and middle adulthood. So the way this lecture is set up is these first few slides are going to be on adolescents and the general relationships that they have, like with their parents, with their friends, with their peers, dating, things like that. Just a few slides on that. And then we will get into family. So most of this lecture will be talking about family. So first, let's talk about adolescent attachment with parents. So adolescents, the ones that basically become the most independent, autonomous individuals, so those that have the best formed identity. So we talked about identity in a previous lecture. Those are the ones that tend to have supportive parents who provide both security and encouragement to explore. So adolescents who have a secure attachment. So that's one of the things we talked about in younger children is a secure attachment, but that is something that extends into adolescence and even into adulthood is these types of attachment with parents. So adolescents who enjoy a secure attachment relationships with their parents tend to have stronger sense of identity, higher self-esteem, greater social confidence, better emotional adjustment, and fewer behavioral problems than their less securely attached peers. So it is very important. The adolescent adult attachment or relationship is very important for adolescent development. We've got this preconceived notion that adolescents and their parents have to fight. And while the amount of disagreement or clash between parents and adolescents, parents and children does increase in adolescence, it is something that is not necessarily or in general in the best adapted individuals, not a guarantee, not something that has to happen. Like I said, there tends to be an increase, but it's not like adolescents and their parents have to really fight for the adolescents to become independent. Adolescents who have really good relationships and strong, secure attachments to their parents actually form strong identities without the need for that conflict. In terms of friendships, so we talked about friendships in childhood, in adolescence. These friendships, they change qualitatively. They're based upon things like enjoyment of common activities in early childhood. In late childhood, it becomes about mutual loyalty. In adolescence, it becomes about intimacy and self-disclosure. Intimacy doesn't mean romantic intimacy. It just means more being able to be more personal. So self-disclosure, sharing secrets, sharing personal details. These are the types of things that in adolescence make the friendships, essentially. And teens do form friendships with peers who are similar to themselves. Whereas in childhood, they'll form friendships with just about anyone that's around them. In once adolescence into once puberty, these friendships tend to become more restrictive to those who are more like themselves, similar to themselves. So you'll see friendships that were present from early childhood till adolescence go away because there's enough differences between the individuals. Whereas the teens tend to form it with people who have similar interests, that type of thing. When I mean similar interests, I mean more specific similar interests. As far as peers and peer pressures in peer relations, peers actually foster more positive behaviors among teens than negative behaviors. We talk about peer pressure as if it's a huge negative and how peer pressure causes children to do things and adolescents to do things that they wouldn't normally do. But in actuality, what's been found with the research is having a good peer group keeps people out of trouble, keeps adolescents out of trouble more than it gets them into trouble. There are, of course, peer groups that lead to negative behaviors. And even in positive peer groups, some negative behaviors can come from that. But in general, the majority of peer interactions are positive, not negative. At around 14 to 15, teens are very dependent upon their peers. They may go along there with the crowd, take risks that they wouldn't take when they're alone. However, again, going along with the crowd may actually keep them out of trouble if the crowd that they're going along with isn't doing things that would be considered troublesome. And troublesome conformity to peers is much less likely amongst adolescents who have that secure, warm, authoritative, that's something we'll talk about in just a little bit, authoritative attachment to parents who are neither too strict nor too lax. Having parents that are willing to talk, willing to communicate, willing to work with the kids, but also have rules that aren't necessarily too strict, but also aren't too lax, that results in teens and adolescents that are willing to resist going along with the crowd when the crowd is doing something wrong. The last thing we'll talk about here is dating. There's actually 4 phases to dating. We're not going to talk about dating much more than this. We'll talk a little bit about marriage, a little bit about divorce, but we're not going to really talk about dating other than this, that there is 4 phases. And this is 4 phases that is not the 4 phases of dating. This is 4 phases of dating that people go through. So it's not I'm not talking about the 4 phases of a specific relationship. I'm talking about as people get older, they tend to look for different things in relationships. The first phase is the initiation phase. And in early adolescence, relationships that tend to arise tend to be initiation phase relationships. That is where the focus is on the self. More of what does this relationship bring to me? Less focus on the partner and more focus on what the individual gets out of the relationship. And then there's the status phase, which is similar to the initiation phase. What does the individual get out? But what does the other individual bring to the relationship as far as status? So having a romantic relationship with the right kind of partner becomes important because the status that it brings to the peer group. So in the status phase, and this is again mid-adolescence, who you're dating is very important. Then in later adolescence, the affection phase comes around. So it becomes less about the me and more about the relationship itself and what basically can the individual do for their partner. And then in late adolescence into early adulthood, you get the bonding phase, and this is where emotional intimacy is achieved. And this emotional intimacy is achieved basically by commitment and attachment. This is where you actually form an attachment to the partner rather than just the partner from early on being there for what can they do for me, who are they, and then what can I do for them. It now becomes the us. It becomes, the relationship is more about the we rather than the individual in one direction or the other. Okay, so now we're going to talk about family and look at some of the things relating to family. So we'll start with types of family, we'll look at parenting styles, we'll talk about siblings, we'll look at adulthood, and in adulthood we'll look at some things like marriage, childbearing, we'll even look at grandparenting, even though this is the young and middle adulthood chapter, and we'll finish with a little bit with abuse, just touch on it at the end. So first we have to define what is family. And this is a really tough thing to define. Why is it a tough thing to define? Because there is so much variability in what different people view as family. Some people will view family as only a mother, father, and children. And you're not a family unless you have children. That is what's referred to as the nuclear family, and that's the classical definition of what a family is. Others say that anytime you have two people in an attachment of some form, you've got a family. So two people in a long-term relationship, they're a family. One person with a kid, they're a family. Two people with kids. One kid, multiple kids. Grandparents and parents and kids all staying together. That's family. The point is there is no one definition. We are going to loosely define it as any group of people that have connections, strong emotional connections to each other. But again, that doesn't fit all definitions, and it all things that qualify as family don't fit within that. So we have to, going ahead, we have to look at it in a very loose way. But let's look at understanding what the family is. So proponents of the family systems theory view family as a system. And this family has many subsystems. So you've got the marital system, you've got the parent-child system, you've got siblings, you've got co-parenting. The family is also a system within other systems. You've got the family within the community, within the religion, within various different other systems. So those who follow family systems theory, specifically systems theory, look at basically the family as a system with many subsystems, and it is a subsystem within other systems. I already mentioned this, but you've got the nuclear family. This typically consists of a father, mother, and at least one child. This is our classical definition of family. This used to be the only thing that was defined as family. Now we look at family as much more open than that, but that is our classic definition. Then you've also got the extended family household, and this is where parents and their children live together with other kin. So aunts, uncles, grandparents, any of these that would be within this extended family household. In some cultures, the extended family household is actually our traditional definition. You look at like Hispanic culture, and having multiple generations within one household is the norm, not the exception. Whereas in the U.S., it's more the exception. You look at other cultures, some Indian subcultures, having multiple generations in the home is the norm. So when we look at this, that's another reason why it's hard to define, is because there are so many cultural differences. So when we look at what is family and understand it, just have to understand that there's multiple different things going on. So again, looking at systems theory, and how not just systems theory, but how the definition of family is changing. There are more single adults. Often they're living with a partner or a partner and their children, but they're unmarried. Used to be you had to be married to be classified as it. Now there's more single. Some people are single without living in a relationship. Some people are counted as non-married, and by our classical definition, that's single, but they're not married even if they're in a relationship. Some are in a relationship and living with their partner. Some are in a relationship and not living with their partner. So there are more unmarried parents. 40% of births in 2007 were to unmarried women. There are more single parent families. So it's becoming such that there are more and more single parent, unmarried, not in a relationship, especially women who are that it's just them and their offspring. There are also more children living in poverty. So, and some of this is related to the number of single parent families. because single parent families don't have the option for two incomes or the option for one parent to stay home with the children while the other parent raises money. Or uh, so in cases now where, especially single parent, the one that's the caregiver, they have to pay for child support, not child support, they have to pay for child care of some form. So related to that, there's more working mothers. In 2005, 60% of married women with children younger than 6 worked outside the home. So it's not just more unmarried mothers, but it's more working mothers as well. And one of the other changing things is there are fewer and fewer children. So in 1998, 19% of women ages 40 to 44 were childless. So there's not just are there fewer children, there's more and more families that are choosing to not have children. Let's look at this changing world even more. There are more people that are waiting to get married. So the average age of first marriage in 2009 was 26 for women and 28 for men. Prior to this, you go back to the 70s, and it was 21 for women and 23 for men. You go back even farther than that, it was 19 for women and 21 for men. So the people are waiting longer to get married. 4 in 10 newly married couples can expect a divorce. It's actually higher than that now. I think it's up to 6 in 10. So there's more divorce. Because of that, up to half or more of children can expect to experience divorce at some point in their development. As a result of more divorce, there's also more remarriages. So there's more people that are getting remarried. That means there's more blended families, reconstituted families, where there's one parent, step-parent, children, multiple step-parents. So the father has remarried, so there's a stepmother. The mother's remarried, so there's a stepfather. There's shared custody, so the children are really now have 4 parents rather than 2. More with this changing world, there's more multi-generational families now. I said before that some cultures it was the norm, but as time goes on, it's becoming the norm in more and more in other cultures. So even in standard U.S. Culture, it's becoming more common for there to be 3 or even 4 generations of families to be living in a home or living closer to the grandparents. More children today than the past know their grandparents and their great-grandparents. Some of this is because of longer lifespans. So longer lifespans mean that that people are living longer, so the grandparents get to know them. But also there's the fact that we've got more people living closer to their families now. That's something that, so we go back 50, 60 years, there was little mobility. People tended to live close to their family home. Then for a while there was a lot of mobility. People tended to move away. Well, now we're going back to that lower mobility where people tend to either live closer to their parents or to have closer relationships. So we've got video calling now, Skype, Zoom, all of that. So grandparents and grandchildren are spending more time together. So people, maybe the grandparents live nearby. I know growing up within my family, I lived 2 miles from my grandparents. I had cousins that lived across the street, and I had other cousins that lived 100 yards away from my grandparents. So it was very close together. There's also fewer caregivers for aging adults now. And because there's smaller families with fewer children and an increased number of adults living alone, we've got this increased longevity, and we still have increased geographic mobility. I just got done talking about how there's lower now, but there's still, to some extent, geographic mobility. Grandparents meeting and interacting with their grandchildren through Zoom is not the same as people who are older, who need medical care, who need someone to take care of them You can't take care of someone over Zoom. You can meet and interact with people over Zoom. So that increased geographic mobility is actually meaning caregivers for adults, aging adults, is diminished. So all of this together is just a bunch of changes that we have to the family, and it's why we can't clearly define what the family is. Next, let's look at some similarities and differences in mothers and fathers in care for infants. So researchers have actually found that fathers and mothers are actually way more similar than different in the ways they act with infants and young children. That being said, there are some differences and similarities within there. So first, fathers are no less able than mothers to feed their babies effectively. There's this preconceived notion that fathers can't feed as well as mothers. Obviously, fathers can't breastfeed, but when we're talking about bottle feeding and other types of feeding, especially later, there is no real difference there between mothers and fathers in their ability to feed the babies. Both fathers and mothers provide sensitive parenting, become objects of attachment, and serve as secure bases for their infants' explorations. So again, these are things that used to be only attributed to mothers. That's why if you look at a lot of the historical research on offspring, it's always mother offspring, it's rarely father. But when they do include father offspring in the research, there's been little, if any, differences found in these domains. So there's no basis existing for thinking that mothers are uniquely qualified to parent and that men are hopelessly inept around babies. That's actually a sexist caricature. I cannot say the word right now, but it is very not supported by the evidence. The evidence actually shows that there is very little differences between mothers and fathers, especially when you're looking at single parents. When you're considering the context of single parents, both mothers and fathers provide equal care. They have equal skills and they have equal limitations. However, there are some differences in the quality and style of parenting they provide, especially when we're talking in the domain of families with two parents. So household with two parents. So we're not talking here as much about the context of basically single parents that are raising kids alone. We're talking here in the context in two-parent households. So in two-parent households, mothers tend to spend more time with the children than fathers do. And this is even controlling for mothers working outside the home. When mothers interact with the children, a large proportion of their time is devoted to caregiving, such as offering food, changing diapers, wiping nose, so on. So, again, this is in the context of two-parent households. Mothers tend to have more caregiving interactions. Fathers spend their more time with playful interactions, tickling, poking, bouncing, surprising. So fathers do more training is one way that it's looked at. Is fathers spend more time training on how to do things. Mothers spend more time caregiving or caring for. Mothers tend to hold more children more, talk to and play quieter with infants than fathers do. But again, fathers are able to adopt that mother-like caregiver role if they're the primary responsibility for the children. This isn't as much of a sex difference as it is a gender difference. So it's a difference that tends to be what is commonly accepted in society, and that's why you get it that way. So even in two-parent households, if the father is the caregiver, these roles that I've been talking about actually flip. And the fathers tend to be the ones that are doing more of the caregiving and mothers do more of the training. Okay, we're going to talk about some parenting styles here. And we're going to talk about the 4 different parenting styles. But when we talk about the parenting styles, the first thing we have to talk about is the 2 questions that we have to ask ourselves. And the first of these 2 questions is acceptance versus responsiveness. Acceptance responsiveness refers to the extent to which parents are supportive and sensitive to their child's needs. So this is basically, are they willing to provide affection and praise when their children meet their expectations? So how accepting are they? How responsive are they? So this is going to include things like affection, praise, and encouragement, whereas conversely, less accepting and responsive parents tend to criticize more, they tend to punish more, belittle, they might possibly be even ignoring, they might ignore their children. And a big thing is they rarely communicate to their children that they're loved and valued. So acceptance responsiveness has a lot to do with communication. Warm and responsive parents is associated with secure attachments to parents, academic competence, high self-esteem, good social skills, good peer acceptance, strong sense of morality. So those in high acceptance responsiveness are the ones that are going to communicate, they're going to be sensitive, they're going to talk to. Those with low responsiveness, on the other hand, are going to be more likely to, and I'm just going to erase that because that's in a bad place. Those with low responsiveness, they tend to less communication, more direct, criticizing, belittling, or even ignoring. The other major question to ask is, or spectrum, is demandingness and control. So demandingness, control, sometimes called permissiveness, restrictiveness, refers to how much control over decision lies in the parents rather than the child. So high controlling parents, those with high controlling, high demanding, they set rules. They expect their children to follow them, and they monitor their children closely to ensure that the rules are followed. Less controlling, often called permissive parents. So we're going to look at a category that even falls under this. But when we're looking at this, sometimes it's called demandingness, permissiveness spectrum. The less controlling parents make fewer demands, allow their children to do whatever they want, to explore, to express their opinions and emotions, and to make decisions. So when we're looking at this, we've got this spectrum of essentially control. And those in the controlling, they've got more control, and the children have less, basically, ability to do what they want. Those down here, the children with less controlling or permissive, the children have more ability to do what they want. Now, in these 2 different things that we've been talking about, acceptance, responsiveness, and demandingness, control, individually, they don't do too much. What we have to look at actually is what happens when we have both of them together. And from that, we're going to have 4 different types. We're going to have high demandingness, high acceptance, low demandingness, high acceptance, and then also high and low demandingness with low acceptance as well. So we're going to look at all 4 of those, and those are our 4 standard parenting styles. Let's start with authoritarian. Authoritarian parenting is characterized by, and we'll put these up in the corner, demanding, high and low, and accepting, high and low. We're going to have, and I'm going to have to put this on each of these slides, but we've got high and low demanding, high and low accepting. Authoritarian parenting style is a restrictive parenting style. It's a parenting style that combines high demandingness with low acceptance. So it's going to go here. It's going to be high demanding, so there's a lot of rules set, but low acceptance. The parents aren't willing to talk to the kids. It's basically the parents impose rules, expect strict obedience, rarely explain why the child should comply with the rules, often rely on power tactics such as physical punishment and the like to gain compliance. So this is the parenting style that is essentially associated with my way or the highway, where there's rules. That's rules are actually important, but there's rules, but there's low communication. So there's low acceptingness. I always like to, when I'm explaining these, give examples from that 70s show. Now that 70s show is getting a bit older now, but for those of you that have watched it, actually all of these parenting styles that we're going to talk about, there is classic cases from that 70s show. In authoritarian parenting, the my way or the highway, if you've watched that 70s show, who do you know has this, which parent has this parenting style? Well, that would be Red Foreman. He sets rules, and he's very explicit about the rules. There's no discussion, there's no communication. It's you follow the rules, and that's all there is to it. So the authoritarian parenting style would be Red Foreman. The next is the authoritative parenting style. So again, we've got demand up here, we've got acceptance. I'm not even going to write the full word. We've got high and low, high and low. We've got our 4. So authoritative parenting style is classified as they're more flexible, and basically they're accepting and responsive, but they still are demanding and exert control. So they have high demandingness, but they also have high acceptance. So those with authoritative parenting style, they're high in both acceptiveness and demanding. They'll set clear rules. They consistently enforce these rules, so that's the demandingness side. But they will also talk to the children. They'll explain the rationale for the rules and restrictions. They're responsive to the children's needs and point of view. This involves the children in decision making. If the children don't like a rule, the children are allowed to basically give their opinion on it. It doesn't mean the parent's going to change the rule, but the parent may change the rule if the children have a justified reason for it. So these parents, they're authoritative parents, they're reasonable, democratic in their approach, but they're still in charge. The way I always look at it, and you can use up your own way, make up your own way, but I always look at the IVE at the end as in give and take, authoritative, they're give and take. They set the rules, but they have give and take, and they're communicative. They'll communicate respect for their children. They'll communicate why the rules are the way they are. That type of thing. So authoritative parenting is high demandingness, high acceptingness. The next is going to be permissive. And I already said permissive as one of the characterized as low demandingness. So we know it's going to be on the low end of demandingness, but it's also, when we're talking high and low acceptance, permissiveness is going to come with high acceptance. So, but low demandingness. So high acceptance, low demandingness. We've got low demandingness, high acceptance. So there's very few rules, but they're also communicative with their parents. Permissive parents are indulgent. There's few rules, few demands. They encourage children to express their feelings and impulses. They rarely exert control. And permissive parents tend to try to be more friends with their children first and parents second, if at all. So it's got that, permissive parenting has that advantage of the high acceptance. There's goods from that. However, there's very little demandingness, there's very little control, so the kids end up oftentimes walking right over them. The kids have no discipline because there's no rules set. And again, like I said, the parents with this parenting style tend to look at their kids more as friends rather than as children, as their children. They try and be their kids' friends. The final is neglectful. So we've got demanding, high and low. We've got accepting. High and low, that's really bad. But we've got accepting and demanding, high and low. As you can expect, this is going to be low in both. There's low demandingness, low acceptingness, neglectful parenting are parents who are just, they don't set rules and they don't actually communicate with their parents. They're pretty much uninvolved with the children's upbringing. They don't seem to care much about the children. They may even reject them. Some neglectful parents aren't neglectful because they want to be. They're just neglectful because they're overwhelmed by their own problems. So in a sense, they don't have the energy to express love and their rules. Oh, I forgot that 70s show. So authoritative parenting style. Authoritative parenting style where they set rules, but they're also willing to be communicative. Who is this? That would be Kitty. She sets rules for the kids, but she also talks to them. How about permissive? Well, this would be both of Donna's parents are permissive. They let her do basically whatever she wants, but they also communicate with her, especially her mom. Her mom just wants to be her friend, doesn't want to be her mom. Neglectful, this would be Hyde's mom, who, interestingly enough, is Leela from why did so she was the mom on Married with Children. She's Leela on Futurama, but she was Hyde's mom in that 70s show, and she basically just abandoned him. So she was very neglectful. So those are the 4. Let's look at some outcomes of these parenting styles. First, children of authoritarian parents, they tend to be moody and unhappy. They're easily annoyed, aimless, unpleasant to be around. They tend to have some issues many issues simply because they basically were brought up to follow rules. Children of authoritative parents, on the other hand, tend to be the best adjusted. They tend to be cheerful, socially responsible, self-reliant, achievement-oriented, cooperative, all of those. So authoritative is the best parenting style for children's outcomes. Permissive, they tend to have children of permissive parents tend to be impulsive, aggressive, self-centered, rebellious, aimless, low in independence and achievement. And finally, neglectful, there's a lot of problems here: aggression, temper tantrums, hostility, antisocial, drug and alcohol abuse, all of these. One thing when we're talking about parenting styles is we should always include or look at how SES, social economic status, or essentially wealth, how this affects it. So compared with middle class and upper class parents, lower class, working class parents tend to stress obedience and respect for authority more. They tend to be more authoritarian. They tend to have less give and take. And they tend to be very restrictive and authoritarian. They are less likely to show warmth and affection. And this could be for various different reasons. It could be that their economic stress results in this, and their inconsistent parenting and their authoritarian thing. They might have to work so much and be under so much stress and pressure that they just bring this home. It also could just be due to financial. They don't have the financial resources to invest in their children's development. And it also could be, one of these perspectives is that they're actually training their kids to be employees. They're training their kids this orientation towards preparing children to obey a boss rather than be a boss. And this is more of a economic and societal issue than it is a specific to anything else to do with the parents. they're an employee and they're training their kids to be employees, that type of thing. So it's just one of those, we could talk about this more, but it's just one of those things to consider when you're looking at this, that children of lower class and working class parents tend to be raised in an atmosphere that is more directing them towards being lower class and working class themselves. Okay, I'm going to go through some of these slides a little bit faster. We're just going to kind of look at an overview of some of these things like sibling relationships, so how the family system changes when a new child arrives. Researchers have found that mothers typically pay less attention to older children when a new baby arrives, so the children tend to resent losing a parent's attention, and they demonstrate difficult behaviors. So when new children arrive, older children tend to become more difficult. They tend to become more defiant. And sibling relationships do involve, though, closeness, but they also involve conflict. So sibling rivalry is a thing that occurs. The spirit of competition, jealousy, resentment between brothers and sisters, it's normal, it's common. When we look at it evolutionarily, they're fighting for their parents' resources, which include time. So this is a normal thing that would occur. Siblings are motivated to compete with each other for their parents' time. However, siblings do have important functions on children's development. Siblings can provide emotional support that they wouldn't get if they didn't have siblings, if there were an only child. Older siblings tend to provide caregiving services. Older siblings serve as teachers, so younger siblings tend to learn a lot of things quicker. Not necessarily book smart things, but real world application things. So siblings provide social experience. Those with siblings tend to be better adjusted in many ways because they are getting social experience from a young age. Okay, let's now move on to adulthood. We're going to look at marriage, childbearing, and grandparenting. All right, let's talk about marriage now. So in the US, almost 90% of adults choose to marry at some point in their lives. Like I said earlier in the lecture, they tend to be waiting till later, so the average age of marriage is getting older. However, still a large percentage of people do get married. When people get married, the perceptions of the marital relationship, they become less favorable. Marital satisfaction, it tends to all decline in their first year of marriage. And then couples who do remain married but are unhappy typically have experienced relatively poor relationships all along. So what do I mean by that? What do I mean is that those who remain married but are unhappy in the marriage, they actually tended to have unhappiness before they got married as well. So it's one of those things when you're preparing to get married, really look at how life is. Look at how your relationship is. Because if you're not happy, or if you have lots of experiences of being unhappy in your relationship, or your partner does, marriage tends to just exacerbate that. It tends to just get larger. There are some people who manage to make it work, but in general, those who have a poor relationship before marriage have a poor relationship after marriage. So this is one thing we're going to talk about. So relationship satisfaction, its highest rate before marriage, in the first year after, and in the honeymoon period right after the marriage. That's when relationship satisfaction is really high. In the first year after marriage, though, it tends to decline. New parenthood also is another period of time where we're going to look at when we're looking at relationship satisfaction, because new parenthood is best described as a stressful life transition that involves both positive and negative changes. New parents find that it is challenging to juggle work, family, friends, and all the responsibilities that are involved in being a mother or a father. New parents get less sleep. They find that they have less personal time. They might have financial problems because maybe they can't work as much as they were before, or there's all these new costs involved with having a child. And what we know is marital satisfaction typically declines somewhat in the first year after a baby is born. And that involves any baby. So the first baby, it declines. The next baby, it declines as well. Not as much. Every offspring you have, marital satisfaction tends to go down. So it goes down in the first year and it goes down with each child. So that is one thing, that marital satisfaction does tend to decline like this over time. And here's the next step to that, that when the firstborn child in the family reaches puberty, marital satisfaction declines even more. There tends to be more parent-child conflict due to parents' conflict with each other regarding how to raise and manage the adolescent children. So there's more conflict going on, there's more stress with that. You then have the fact that the maturation of adolescence can cause parents to have what would be referred to classically as a midlife crisis. There's no such thing as a midlife crisis, but where parents are starting to question what they have done with their lives, what comes next, that type of thing. So marital satisfaction, it declines in the first year after marriage. It declines after each child. It declines after the first child reaches adolescence. So there's all these declines that happen throughout the lifespan. And we'll talk about it in just a little bit, and we're going to talk about grandparenting first, but then in just a little bit we'll talk about what happens to marital satisfaction after. So let's talk about grandparenting for 2 slides real quick. First is we're going to talk about what types of grandparenting there is. There are 3 main types of grandparents. There's the remote grandparents. It's becoming less, but 29% of a major sample was remote grandparents. These are grandparents that are only seen occasionally by the grandchildren. They're almost symbolic figures. As I said when I was talking about this before, this is becoming less the case though, because you have the fact that things like Zoom and the ability to do FaceTime and all of these are actually increasing interactions. So instead of a grandparent being someone that's only seen at holidays, now children are spending an hour to 2 hours a week even with grandparents that, or more, with grandparents that live on the other side of the world. So there is this interaction that's going on. So the grandparents aren't just a distant mythical figure that's seen once or twice a year. There's also compassionate. Compassionate grandparents see their grandchildren frequently and enjoy sharing activities with them. So compassionate grandparents, they can be ones that are nearby, ones that are in the same town, but the grandchildren see their grandparents often. Not all the time, but often. And they become basically fun grandparents because activities are enjoyed being shared with these grandparents. Maybe going to the zoo, or there's toys that are at the grandparents and going and visiting. And then the final one are involved grandparents. And these are ones that take on a parent-like role to one extent or another. So these are grandparents that help with childcare, give advice, and play other practical roles in their grandchildren's lives. So a grandparent that is occasionally babysitting, maybe like an hour in the morning before the school bus picks them up, stuff like that, that's still going to fall under compassionate. When we're looking at involved, we're talking about ones that are almost becoming a primary caregiver. So not an hour a day, but 8 hours a day. So if childcare, instead of the children going to a childcare center or something else related, they're instead with the grandparents. Then the grandparents become a parent, a primary caregiver, not a secondary caregiver that is there to be more of like a friend with the compassionate. So it is something that really needs to be looked at, because one of the issues is that involved grandparents, it causes a lot of stress. So serving as an involved grandparent does take a huge toll. When grandchildren move in with the grandparents, or spend a significant amount of time with them, and the grandparents become primary, the parents, the older adults, experience a lot of stress, depression, and deteriorating health, and involve these fully um, these fully involved grandparents tend to have shorter lifespans because they're not getting to enjoy being grandparents. They are instead being stressed out with the caregiving. So we've been talking about all of this and how marital satisfaction leads up to this and all of that, but let's look now at what happens, or the reverse of it, or the other end of it. So marital satisfaction, as I said, it dips somewhat after the honeymoon period, dips still lower with new parenthood, continues to drop as new children are added to the family, drops more with the first child reaching adolescence, and it actually recovers when children leave the nest, especially for women. During this time, when all the children are gone, psychological intimacy will increase. Elderly couples are actually more affectionate than middle-aged couples. They tend to have fewer conflicts, and they tend to be able to resolve their conflicts without as much venting of negative emotions. Now, there's two reasons for this. So the first reason is going to be because less stress. So there's less stress. Kids are stress. They're positive stress. There's benefits to having kids, but kids are stress. So there's less stress. So couples that don't have kids in the home because they've all left, they have less stress. But second, why do older couples tend to get along better? Because older couples are the ones who stay together. Older couples that have been together longer are the ones that stay together. Couples that have conflict, they got divorced. Couples who have lots of issues, they got divorced. They're no longer together. The couples who stayed together tend to be the ones who had less conflict. So older couples, they're the ones who stayed together. They tend to be the ones who had less conflict all along, so they have less conflict now. So relating to that, happily married people are the ones that are emotionally stable and vent negative feelings less than unhappily married people. And in happy marriages, the personalities of the partners tend to be more similar, and they're likely to remain similar or even become more similar over the years. That is one thing. Couples, they tend to become more alike over time. Couples start out with many differences, and I'm not saying that they adopt exactly all of the same hobbies and everything as their partner, but they tend to, personality-wise, become more alike. They tend to start to enjoy their partner's hobbies, and they reinforce the traits that brought them together. And again, this is in the couples that stay together. The couples that don't stay together are the ones that don't end up becoming more alike. So I've been talking about children a lot and how children's effects are on relationships, but let's look at childless married couples. So a growing number of adults are deciding to delay having children or not having them at all. This is especially the case in higher educated, high status, stable career adults. And one thing that's been found is all of those dips, most of those dips, not all of them, most of those dips I was talking about with marital satisfaction, where it tends to go down when kids are added, when kids get older, childless couples actually tend to stay higher than that of couples with children during the childbearing years. And one of the things that's always been believed is that middle-aged and elderly couples will regret not having children, But what's been found is actually that middle-aged and elderly couples, childless couples, report being no less satisfied with their lives than parents whose children have left the nest. In actuality, in some studies, middle-aged and elderly childless couples have lower levels of depression than parents. I will say that a lot of those loss in marital satisfaction for couples with children, it comes back after the children leave the nest. So when you get to this point here, there tends to be pretty level or pretty even levels of satisfaction. Because again, a lot of the parents that, or not just parents, a lot of the couples that had issues, they've already broke up, they've already divorced. So you're left with the couples that do get along, and marital satisfaction across childless and couples with children is pretty even. Let's transition into talking about gay and lesbian families, because we've got to look at the things that go into it. There's a lot of comments or statements that have been made historically about gay and lesbian couples not being as good of parents or other issues there. But what's actually been found is that gay men and lesbian women, they may live as couples. They may live as singles. They may live without children or with children. Some of them even live with groups of friends that constitute a family. So they live in very similar ways to heterosexual individuals. And however, they do face challenges. So absence of recognition of marriage or a family, that's changed a lot in the last 10 years, but there still is, and some people don't recognize them as marriage. There's still discrimination. There's still absence of full legal rights or legal status in many cases, even though, as I said, that is changing. It was the case, and it's still in the case in some places, where if you have, let's say, a gay couple, and they have kids, and one of the kids is one of the parents, in the couple is the actual biological parent of the kid. The other one is not the biological parent, obviously. Both can't be the biological parent. But they raise this kid together from birth. This kid is 15 years old, and the biological parent dies for whatever reason. The other parent has raised this kid as their own from birth. The kid is now 15. Up until recently, and still in some places, that kid would be taken away from that parent because of that parent isn't the legal parent, because of the fact that wasn't the biological parent, and it was a gay couple, so they couldn't marry, the second one couldn't adopt. Like I said, that is changing. It's changed in a lot of places, but there are still some places where that's in effect. So it's really unfortunate. And I'm getting up on my soapbox and soapboxing about the fact that we need more LGBTQ plus rights, more equality, and all of that. If not for those that are LGBTQ plus, but for their children. As far as that is concerned, researchers have actually found that children who live with two parents of the same sex are actually better off in terms of developmental outcome than children who live with a single mother. They're about the same as parents or children of two parents, but it has better developmental outcomes than a single mother. One of the worst we've found actually is developmental outcomes is with a single mother, unfortunately. So having two parents is better than one, even if you've got a bias against same-sex couples. Having two parents is shown to be scientifically better than one. Researchers have found that children who live with two parents of the same sex are no different than children living with two heterosexual parents. And one of the things that's always, not always, but used to be really big concern, and is still a concern to some people who are really against homosexuality, is that, well, children who grow up in homosexual households are more likely to be homosexual themselves. But what's actually been found is that children who live with two parents of the same sex are no more likely than children of heterosexual parents to develop homosexual or bisexual orientation. especially as we're becoming more open as a society. The only thing is, the major difference, at least historically, is children with homosexual parents who are homosexual or bisexual themselves tend to be more open with their parents and more accepted. And like I said, that's changing, but it's still got some issues there. All right, I'll get off my soapbox. It's just something that definitely something good to be really passionate about is getting equality to everyone. And when you're talking about this, you really have to consider the kids and how the kids are actually better off in these situations than in many other situations. Okay, next let's look at divorce. We'll talk about divorce for just a little bit, and then we'll talk about family violence, and that's the end of these slides. Let's look at those who are highest risk of divorce. So highest risk is those that are younger. So those in their 20s and 30s are more at risk. It's actually an average of about 7 years of marriage when divorce occurs. They often have young children due to that I was talking about before with the decline in marital satisfaction. Lots of stress with young children. That stress can cause a dissolution of the relationship. Those who marry young. So the younger you marry, the more likely you are to get a divorce. Those who have short courtships, the shorter you were together before getting married, the more likely you are to get divorced. I knew a guy in the Army who met a girl and 6 days later married her, and they lasted 4 months. So yep, that's definitely the case where shorter relationships can lead to shorter pre-marriage relationships lead to shorter marriages. Those who conceive a child before marriage are more likely to divorce. Those that are low SES, mainly due to lower income and the stress that involves with being lower income. Those who have personality or behavioral problems, those who use and abuse drugs and alcohol, they're more likely to divorce just due to the conflicts that come along with these. And the most common reasons given for divorce is because they feel that their marriage lacks communication, emotional fulfillment, or compatibility. Now, when I'm teaching human sexuality and I talk about divorce, I give all the main reasons. And really the main reason, this isn't the main reason given, this is the main reason it boils down to for divorce, is communication. Lack of communication, miscommunication. The number 2 is financial. So financial issues. Number 3 is sex. Lack of sex or sexual intimacy. So those are going to be the 3 main reasons: communication, money, and sex. But they get translated into other things. As far as children of divorce, children who experience parents' divorce, they're often angry, fearful, depressed, guilty. They're especially guilty or especially have these other things going on if they feel that they were somehow responsible for the parents fighting a divorce. If the children feel that they were why their parents were fighting and why their parents got divorced, it can lead to some pretty severe depression. And so it's parents that are getting divorced, no matter how much they like or hate each other during the divorce, they really need to emphasize to the kids and reiterate to the kids that the kids were of no fault at all. Parents who use the kids against each other during the divorce, this tends to result in kids who have really maladaptive adjustment. Children's behavioral problems make effective parenting difficult, and these deteriorating parenting styles do aggravate children's behavioral problems. So one thing is the children are actually the fault or at fault in many divorces. However, again, the parents should never let the kids know that. After divorce, custodial mothers tend to become less accepting and responsive. They tend to become less authoritative and less consistent in their discipline and more neglectful, or even they become more neglectful because they don't have the time, or they become more authoritarian because they don't have the ability to be as accepting and responsive. Non-custodial fathers are likely to become permissive parents. They indulge their children during visitations. They don't see them as much. They don't have to worry about the raising the child. They just have to worry about making the child happy for the little bit of time the child is with them. So non-custodial fathers, they're more likely to become permissive. And if the cases are reversed, if it's non-custodial mothers, it does become like that. The custodial parent tends to because of stress, because of less time, they just become less accepting and responsive, and the non-custodial parent tends to become more permissive when they do see the kids. As far as children's positive adjustment, things that predict children's positive adjustment are things like adequate financial support. And this is why child support is so important, because if the father has money, or the mother, whoever is the non-custodial, or if we're completely getting rid of sexism, whatever parent made more money, them sharing that money out so that the child has equal financial care in both situations, then the children tend to have the best outcome. Good parenting by the custodial parent is very important. The custodial parent needs to maintain a warm, authoritative, consistent discipline with the children, and then the children are far less likely to experience problems. Good parenting by the non-custodial parent, avoiding the permissiveness, because that permissiveness can lead to behavioral problems. Minimal conflict between the parents. So joint custody, it's important, and this minimal conflict where the parents aren't showing the conflict, especially to the kids. The parents may hate each other, but those kids have to believe that the parents are still friends even if they're not together anymore. So that's very important, and a lot of selfish parents don't adhere to this, and the kids just suffer as a result. Another thing that leads to positive adjustment is additional social supports, like close friends or peer support programs, like church or school, things like that, things where the children have something else to turn to. If there's minimal additional changes, like you don't move across the country, that type of thing, don't switch schools. Switching schools loses those additional social supports, but also throws a lot of things into upheaval. And in addition to all this is just personal resources, so personal genetics, like intelligence, emotional stability, good coping skills. All of these are important for positive adjustment. So positive adjustments of children during a divorce is a multifaceted thing. It's partially their genetics, partially their support structures, and partially how their parents act with them and with each other. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about here is violence and abuse. Got 3 slides of this, and it's a sad thing to end on, but when we're talking about families, we do need to consider this. The most visible form of child violence or family violence is child abuse. This is going to be defined as mistreating or harming a child physically, emotionally, or sexually. We are going to not talk about the sexual abuse. I'll give a statistic, but we're not going to talk about the sexual abuse. Here we're going to more focus on the physical and emotional abuse. So in the U.S., the statistic is actually 11 out of every 1,000 children under age 18 experience child maltreatment. I hope that when you read that statistic, 11 out of every 1,000, that you immediately question it and say that that's got to be bullshit. And the truth is that is actually bullshit. The U.S. official statistic is only including those where you get convictions of parents for child maltreatment. It doesn't include all of the child maltreatment that isn't reported. It doesn't include the child maltreatment that's pushed under the rug. It doesn't include any of that. When you look at this, when you have kids that are taken away from their parents by protective services because of maltreatment, but the parents aren't then prosecuted. That's not actually, doesn't classify as under statistics as child maltreatment because the parents weren't prosecuted. So in actuality, it's actually closer to 1 in 3. 1 in 3 children suffer from physical and or emotional abuse. Emotional abuse is much more likely than the physical abuse, and it's much harder to detect. But the unofficial statistics put it at about 1 in 3 children that suffer from abuse in one form or another, when we're talking physical or emotional. If we're talking sexual abuse, this is the last time I'm going to talk about it here, but when we're talking about sexual abuse, it's actually believed to be about 1 in 5 girls. This is a very, very scary number. About 1 in 5 girls and about 1 in 20 boys. And actually that 1 in 20 boys is climbing higher. It might even be up to 1 in 10 boys now. But about 1 in 5 girls and about 1 in 10 to 1 in 20 boys. And some even say it's higher than 1 in 5 girls. Some say it's 1 in 4 girls. But it's a very high number that experience sexual abuse. One of the statistics that I've heard, and this isn't an official statistics, it's unofficial because you can't really prove it because there's nothing convicted or anything, but in surveys that they've done, they've found that it's actually about 1 in every 10 males in their lifetime will sexually abuse a child, and about 1 in every 20 females in their lifetime will sexually abuse a child. So that is a scary, scary, scary number to think about. That if you look around and see 10 guys, that one of those not is going to be, but one of those is possibly, many of them are possibly. So it's 1 in 10, 10% of guys sexually abuse a child in the lifespan. So it's one of those that there needs to be more focus on. There needs to be more effort on. In my human sexuality class, I talk about this in more detail, and I talk about the fact that we need more research on this. We need to figure this out better so that we can solve this issue, because it is definitely an issue, and it is a issue that isn't talked about that much. It's an issue that is much more prevalent than most people would realize, and it's really scary to think about. Okay, enough talking about that. Let's go back to the physical and emotional maltreatment, which is bad all on its own. So child physical abuse. Child physical abuse, typically or most often the abuser is going to be a young mother. So age is a predicting factor. Younger mothers, younger parents tend to be more likely to be abusers. Why is it a young mother? Well, it's because it's a young single mother. So young single mothers, those who are stressed out, they maybe are unemployed, living in poverty, having many children, having no partner to share the load, under a lot of stress, under a lot of strain, and as a result, they end up taking that strain and stress out on the children. So it doesn't mean others don't. There's a lot of other factors that come in. These are just the most likely factors. Only about 1 in 10 child abusers appear to have a severe psychological disorder. We tend to think that child abusers are those who really have a mental disorder, but actually really what it comes down to is it's a cycle of abuse. Child abusers, they tend to have been abused themselves. Abusive mothers are often battered by their partners. Abusers are often insecure with low self-esteem. And abusive parents tend to have unrealistic expectations about what children can do at different ages. They don't understand normal behavior of infants and young children. They expect the infants and young children to behave in a much more older or mature way. So these are all things that if we were doing, let's say, my class where I talk about aggression, so behavioral neuroscience, where I go into aggression and anger. And one of the main reasons for aggression and anger is frustration. Anger arises typically from frustration, being frustrated from achieving our goals. Well, a lot of this that we're looking at on this slide, you can see the frustration there. A young mother who has many children and doesn't have anyone to share the load, lives in poverty, unemployed, lots of stress. Well, that is frustration, and it just boils over, becomes anger, anger becomes aggression. Those with low self-esteem tend to have more anger issues. Those who are abused themselves, that's frustration that boils over. Those who have unrealistic expectations, there's your frustration boiling over as well. I'm not justifying the behavior by any means. I'm saying the psychological mechanism that's going into it or is behind it. As far as outcomes for children, there are many negative implications. Intellectual deficits and academic difficulties are common amongst those that are mistreated, especially those that are the most mistreated. Physical mistreatment, this is most common, but emotional mistreatment also results in this. Those who are mistreated tend to have social problems, emotional problems, behavioral problems, even maltreated. So physically abused as well as neglected results in this. And those who are the worst treated tend to have issues with empathy. They shut down emotional feelings in themselves because of the abuse. And one thing when you learn emotions is being able to recognize emotions in others, and having normal empathy relies on being able to feel emotions normally yourself. If you shut down emotions yourself, you interpret emotions less in others. Okay. Again, sad note to end on. I hate to end on child abuse, but it is something that we need to talk about when we talk about families. So in review, we started with some adolescent relationships, and then we looked at families. We looked at types of families, parenting styles. We looked at siblings. We looked at adulthood, specifically marriage, childbearing, some grandparenting stuff, even though this is more the middle adulthood stuff. We finished up with abuse just because it needs to be talked about, unfortunately. Okay, that is all I have for this lecture. Up next is more on adults. Thanks, come on back.